The thin, metallic scent of blood was the first thing she registered, a coppery tang that clung to the back of her throat. Isla's world was a throbbing, purple-black ache behind her eyes, her wrists raw against the zip ties that bound them to the cold, unyielding pipe running along the concrete wall. A single bulb, caged in rusty wire, swung lazily overhead, casting long, distorted shadows that danced like ghouls in the damp, cavernous space. This wasn't a kidnapping for ransom. The chilling precision of it, the calculated cruelty in her captor's eyes, told her this was something far more personal, far more sinister. The distant, mournful wail of a train horn was the only sound from the outside world, a ghost of a life she was no longer part of. Her husband, Ryker, would be turning their world upside down looking for her. He was the president of the Iron Serpents MC, a man whose love was as fierce and unwavering as the loyalty of his brotherhood. But here, in this forgotten corner of the city, surrounded by cold stone and the suffocating presence of the man who had taken her, that world felt a million miles away. The man, Silas Croft, a real estate mogul with a soul as rotten as the damp Eden walls, stepped back into the weak circle of light. His suit was immaculate, a stark, cruel contrast to her torn blouse and the grime on her face. He smiled, a thin, bloodless slash in his perfectly manicured face. "Your husband, my dear Isla," he began, his voice a low, cultured purr that was more terrifying than any shout, "is a man of disruptive tendencies. He and his club cost me the waterfront development deal. Million, gone. An expensive lesson I had to teach." He crouched down, his cologne a sickeningly sweet wave that made her stomach clench. "But I find myself in a predicament. The lesson feels incomplete. It needs a punctuation mark. You, my dear, are that punctuation." Isla met his gaze, refusing to let the terror win. She channeled every ounce of Riker's strength she had ever admired. Her voice, when it came, was a dry rasp, but it was steady. "He will find me," she whispered, the words a prayer and a promise. Silas chuckled, a dry, rattling sound. "Oh, I'm counting on it. I want him to come. I want him to feel the same helplessness you feel right now. But by the time he gets here, the lesson will be concluded." He stood, straightening his tie, a predator who had finished admiring his trapped prey. "Scream if you like. No one will hear you but the rats." As his footsteps receded and a heavy metal door slammed shut, plunging her into near darkness, Isla tested the bonds again. Pain shot up her arms, but beneath the pain was a flicker of something else. A cold, hard ember of defiance. He had made a mistake. He thought she was just a biker's wife. He didn't know she was a serpent's queen, and she would not be broken. Ryker slammed his empty coffee mug down on the polished oak table of the Iron Serpents clubhouse, the ceramic cracking with a sharp report that silenced the low murmur of conversation. The sun had risen, painting the grimy windows of the serpent's nest in hues of orange and gray. But for Ryker, the world had gone dark 12 hours ago. Isla was gone. She hadn't come home from the art gallery she managed downtown. Her car was still in its designated spot, locked. Her phone went straight to voicemail. At first, it was a knot of worry. Now, it was a cold, solid block of ice in his gut, a familiar and dreaded feeling he hadn't experienced in years. He stood, his towering frame casting a long shadow across the room. Every eye was on him. His brothers, Deacon, his VP, with a face like a roadmap of old fights, Grizz, the hulking sergeant-at-arms, and a dozen other men clad in leather and loyalty, waited. They saw the storm gathering in their president's eyes. Isla's missing. Riker's voice was a low growl, stripped of all warmth, a piece of gravel scraping against steel. Not late. Not visiting a friend. Gone. The air in the room became thick, heavy with shared history and unspoken vows. These men weren't just a club. They were a family forged in chrome and fire, and Isla was the heart of that family. She was the one who bandaged their wounds, tolerated their rough edges, and saw the men beneath the patches. An attack on her was an attack on the very soul of the Iron Serpents. Deacon stepped forward, his knuckles white where he gripped the back of a chair. We've got feelers out, called every hospital, every precinct. Put the word out to the prospects to check the alleys and the docks. Nothing. It's like she vanished. Ryker paced, the heavy tread of his boots a drumbeat of rising fury. His mind was a maelstrom. He thought of Isla's smile, the way her eyes lit up when she talked about a new painting, the feel of her hand in his. That warmth was now a gaping void, and into that void poured a chilling, focused rage. He stopped and looked at the faces of his men. He saw his own pain reflected back at him, multiplied. This wasn't random, he stated, the words cutting through the tension. Someone took her. Someone who wanted to send a message. Someone who wanted to get to me. He ran a hand over his shorn head, the tattoos on his knuckles stark against his pale skin. We tear this city apart, he commanded, his voice resonating with absolute authority. Every informant, every lowlife, every snake hiding under a rock. We shake them until their teeth rattle. Find out who has the balls to touch what's mine. We don't sleep. We don't eat. We find her. He turned and walked towards the clubhouse doors, grabbing his leather cut, the iron serpent patch on the back seeming to writhe with a life of its own. And when we find him, he added, his voice dropping to a deadly whisper that carried more menace than any shout, we will introduce him to a level of hell he didn't know existed. The roar of 24 Harley-Davidson engines firing up in unison was not just noise. It was a declaration of war. It was the sound of thunder rolling out from the serpent's nest, a promise of retribution that would shake the city to its very foundations. The search began as a methodical, brutal combing of the city's underbelly. The Iron Serpents moved like a leather-clad plague, their presence a palpable threat in the dive bars, chop shops, and back-alley gambling dens that made up the city's nervous system. They weren't asking questions, they were demanding answers. Prospects were sent to plaster telephone poles with Isla's smiling face, a beacon of light in a darkening world. But hours turned into a day, and the city remained stubbornly silent. The usual informants were either genuinely clueless or too terrified to speak, a testament to the power of whoever had taken Isla. Frustration was a corrosive acid eating at the club's morale, but it only sharpened the edge of Ryker's focus. He was a man hollowed out, running on pure, uncut fury. He and Deacon were personally turning over a grimy warehouse district by the industrial canal, the air thick with the smell of rust and stagnant water. It's got to be Croft, Deacon grunted, kicking a loose piece of gravel. The timing's too perfect. We shut down his union-busting operation at the docks last month. Cost him a fortune. He's the only one with the resources and the stones. Ryker nodded grimly, his eyes scanning the rows of dilapidated buildings. Stones are one thing. This is something else. This is quiet. Professional. Croft is a snake, but he's a loud one. This feels different. While Ryker wrestled with the grand strategy, Isla fought her own war on a much smaller scale. In the suffocating silence of her cell, she had discovered she could just barely touch the sharp, rusted edge of a broken conduit clamp with the fingers of her right hand if she contorted her body at a painful angle. For hours, she had been sawing a tiny, almost imperceptible movement at the thick plastic of her right zip tie. The pain was excruciating, a searing line of fire across her wrist, but she focused on the image of Ryker's face, on the memory of his arms around her. Hope was a weapon, and she would wield it until her last breath. Silas Croft visited her again that evening. He didn't bring food or water, only his chilling presence. He stood in the doorway, watching her. Your husband's little gang is making quite a mess, he said conversationally, turning the city inside out. It's rather theatrical. He thinks he's the hero of some grand story. But heroes need a weakness, Isla, a pressure point. He took a step into the room. I've been studying him. He has only 1 inch, he gestured vaguely at her. He's predictable. He'll come here, all thunder and righteous anger. And my men will be waiting. I've invested in the best private security money can buy. Ex-military. They don't have a code of brotherhood. They have a contract. Isla said nothing, her energy focused on the slow, agonizing work on her bonds. Her silence seemed to amuse him. You see, this isn't just about money anymore, Silas continued, his voice taking on a fanatical edge. It's about order. People like your husband, they represent chaos. They operate outside the system. I am a system. I am proving that my system of wealth, of influence, of absolute control is superior. When he lies broken at your feet, you will understand he left as abruptly as he arrived, the slam of the door echoing in a vast space. Isla slumped against the pipe, sweat and tears mingling on her face. Her wrist was a raw, bloody mess, but she could feel it, a tiny bit of give in the plastic. It was a start. Back in the desolate warehouse district, Deacon knelt, his flashlight beam cutting a sharp cone through the gloom. Over here, he was pointing at a storm drain grate. Tucked into the rusted ironwork, almost invisible, was a small, vibrant blue feather. It was from a unique, custom-made earring Isla had bought at an art fair just last week. She'd been so proud of it. Ryker picked it up with a reverence that fell out of place amidst the filth. He rolled the delicate thing between his thumb and forefinger. It wasn't dropped by accident. It was placed, deliberately. A sign, a breadcrumb. She's alive, he breathed, the words a mix of relief and renewed determination. She's fighting. She had been in a vehicle, and she'd managed to push this out. It meant they were on the right trail. It was the first crack of light in his suffocating darkness, and it was enough to reignite the fire. The blue feather narrowed the search grid to the industrial sector, but it was still a vast, sprawling labyrinth of decaying factories and anonymous storage facilities. The Serpents set up a mobile command post in a derelict auto body shop, the scent of old oil and stale coffee hanging in the air. Maps were spread over greasy workbenches, marked with red circles and crossed-out zones. The mood was grimly efficient. Every dead end, every fruitless raid on an empty building chipped away at their hope. It was during one of these low points, as Deacon argued with another member over a conflicting tip, that a shadow detached itself from a nearby alley. A boy, no older than 15, thin and wiry with eyes that held the cautious wisdom of someone who had seen too much, stood at the edge of the light spilling from the garage. He clutched a tattered backpack to his chest like a shield. "You looking for the lady?" the boy asked, his voice quiet but clear. Grizz, the hulking sergeant-at-arms, took a step toward him. "Beat it, kid. We're busy. I saw her," the boy insisted, not flinching. "I saw the van." That got Ryker's attention. He pushed himself off the fender he was leaning against and walked toward the boy, his sheer size making the kid look even smaller. But the boy held his ground. Ryker knelt, bringing himself down to the boy's level, a gesture of respect that surprised his own men. "What did you see?" he asked, his voice low and serious. "My name's Finn," the boy said, emboldened. "I sleep in the old cannery, over by the river. 2 nights ago, a black van, no windows. It pulled into the old Hyperion Textiles warehouse. The big one with the tall fence." He swallowed hard. "I heard a woman yell just once. Then they pulled her out. They were wearing suits. One of them, he looked like the devil." Finn's description of the man was chillingly accurate. "Silas Croft. Why didn't you go to the cops?" Deacon asked, his voice laced with suspicion. Finn snorted, a sound of pure cynicism. "Cops don't care about kids in alleys. They just run me off. But then I saw her picture." He pointed a grimy finger at one of the flyers pasted on a nearby pole. "That's her. I know it is." Ryker felt a surge of something he hadn't felt since this began. Certainty. This was it. He looked into Finn's eyes and saw no deceit, only a stark, honest truth. This kid, invisible to the rest of the world, had seen everything. As Ryker processed this, his mind flashed back, an unwelcome specter from his past. He was a boy again, not much older than Finn. His own sister, Sarah, her face bruised, her eyes empty. Their stepfather, a man with a heavy hand and a serpent's tongue, had ruled their home with fear. Ryker had been too young, too scared to do anything but watch. One night, the man had gone too far. Ryker had tried to intervene, and for his trouble, he'd been thrown across the room, his arm broken. He could still hear Sarah's cries, his own feeling of pathetic helplessness. She had run away a week later, and he'd never seen her again. That failure had haunted him his entire life. It was the ghost that rode on his shoulders, the reason he'd built the Iron Serpents not as a gang, but as a shield for the defenseless. It was the reason he would never, ever fail to protect his family again. He blinked, the memory receding, leaving behind a cold, hard resolve. He looked at Finn, this boy who was braver than he had been at that age. "Thank you, Finn," Ryker said, his voice thick with emotion. He stood and turned to his men. The weariness was gone from their faces, replaced by a predatory gleam. "Hyperion Textiles," Ryker announced. "That's our target." He placed a heavy hand on Finn's shoulder. "You stay here. You're under our protection now. Deacon, get him some food. Whatever he wants." He looked back at the boy. "You did good, kid. You did real good." Finn, for the first time, allowed a small, hesitant smile. He had been invisible for so long. Tonight, for the first time, he felt seen. And for Ryker, the ghost of his sister's face was replaced by the determined image of Isla, and he knew, with every fiber of his being, that this time he would not be too late. The Hyperion Textiles warehouse was a brick and steel fortress, a relic of a bygone industrial era now repurposed as Silas Croft's private dungeon. It was surrounded by a 10-foot chain-link fence topped with razor wire, with a single, heavily reinforced gate providing the only access. High-definition cameras, small black eyes of surveillance, were mounted at every corner. The serpents, hidden in the shell of a building across the street, studied it through binoculars and a high-powered spotting scope. Finn, now fed and wrapped in a clean club hoodie, sat with them, pointing out details with the familiarity of someone who had spent months observing the patterns of the place from the shadows. "There are 4 guards on the perimeter at all times," Finn explained, his voice low. "They walk the fence line in pairs. They switch every 4 hours. There's another gate at the back for deliveries, but it's always locked from the inside. The main building has motion sensor lights on the ground floor." Ryker listened intently, cross-referencing Finn's ground-level intelligence with a set of old city blueprints Deacon had acquired from a contact at the planning department. The blueprints showed the warehouse's internal layout: a massive central floor, a series of smaller offices on a mezzanine level, and a deep, multi-roomed basement. "That's where she'll be," Ryker said, tapping the basement section on the map. Soundproofed. Isolated, the planning session was intense, a masterclass in organized chaos. The table was littered with schematics, coffee cups, and the occasional greasy wrench. The air was thick with the smell of gun oil as weapons were cleaned and checked. "This isn't a straight-up assault," Deacon said, tracing a line on the map with his finger. "We go in loud. They have time to hurt her. It has to be fast, quiet, and overwhelming." The plan they devised was multi-phased, a symphony of violence and precision. Phase 1, the infiltration. Grizz and a smaller, leaner biker named Twitch would scale the rear wall under the cover of darkness, bypassing the main gate. Their job was to neutralize the perimeter cameras and take out the 2 guards on the back half of the compound silently. They would use suppressed pistols and the element of surprise. Phase 2, the breach. Once the rear was secure, the main force, led by Ryker, would use bolt cutters on the back gate's chain. They would split into 2 teams. Alpha Team, led by Ryker, would make directly for the basement stairs. Bravo Team, led by Deacon, would sweep the main floor and mezzanine, containing any of Croft's other security forces and preventing them from reinforcing the basement. Phase 3, extraction. Once Isla was secured, the teams would converge and execute a fighting withdrawal, using the chaos as cover. A van would be waiting a block away for Isla and a small escort, while the rest of the club would mount their Harleys and create a thunderous, city-wide diversion. As they finalized the details, the dark biker wit that served as their pressure valve began to surface. "So, Grizz," Twitch said, checking the action on his pistol, "if you fall off that wall, try not to land on me." "I just got this cut clean," Grizz grunted. "Don't worry, little man. I'll aim for one of the guards." Break my fall. The humor was grim, but it was necessary. It was the armor they wore against the fear, against the gnawing possibility of failure. Ryker, however, remained silent and focused. He was cleaning his K-bar knife, the rhythmic scrape of the whetstone the only sound in his personal bubble of concentration. Each pass of the blade was a vow. He wasn't just planning an assault. He was preparing for a reckoning. He looked over at Finn, who was watching the proceedings with wide, awestruck eyes. The kid was a part of this now. He had provided the key that would unlock Isla's cage. Ryker knew the club owed him a debt that could never be fully repaid. "All right," Ryker said, his voice cutting through the banter. He stood, his presence commanding immediate silence. "Gear up. We move in 1 hour. Radio silence until Grizz gives the signal. Let's go bring my wife home." The clatter of magazines being loaded and the rustle of leather jackets was the only response. The Iron Serpents were ready. The plan was set. The rage was honed to a razor's edge. All that was left was the storm. Inside the cold, damp basement, Isla's hope was beginning to fray. The work on the zip tie was agonizingly slow. Her wrist was a mangled tapestry of raw flesh and deep abrasions, and the plastic was only fractionally thinner than when she'd started. Every movement sent a jolt of white-hot pain up her arm, and exhaustion was a heavy blanket threatening to smother her resolve. She was dehydrated, hungry, and the darkness was playing tricks on her mind. The shadows writhed, taking on monstrous forms, and the silence was so profound it felt like a physical weight on her chest. She had to do something more. Crying out was pointless, just as Silas had said. But she couldn't just wait for a rescue that might never come. She had to create a signal, something more than a feather that could have been lost anywhere. Her eyes scanned her prison. Concrete walls, the metal pipe she was chained to, the single cage bulb, and a junction box on the far wall. It was old, rusted, and a thick, grimy conduit ran from it up toward the ceiling. Wires. Electricity. An idea, desperate and incredibly risky, sparked in her mind. If she could somehow cause a short, a power surge, it might trip a breaker, flicker the lights, anything to disrupt the building's normal state. It was a long shot, a message in a bottle thrown into an electrical sea, but it was better than nothing. The pipe she was bound to ran the length of the wall, passing directly beneath the junction box. If she could just get her feet up there, it seemed impossible. Her body screamed in protest as she began to move. Using the wall for leverage, she managed to twist herself around, her back now pressed against the cold concrete. Gritting her teeth against the fire in her wrists, she began to inch her way sideways along the pipe, her heels scraping uselessly at the floor. It was a torturous, clumsy shuffle, each movement a fresh wave of agony. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she was positioned directly below the junction box. Now for the hardest part. With a guttural cry of effort, she bent her knees and pushed, trying to get her bound hands higher up the pipe. The metal was slick with condensation, and her muscles, weak from hunger and stress, trembled violently. She failed, slumping back down, gasping for breath. She wouldn't give up. She thought of Ryker's face, the unshakable belief he had in her strength. She gathered herself and tried again. This time, she found a small nub of rust on the pipe that gave her a fractional point of leverage. Pushing with every ounce of strength she possessed, she managed to hoist her torso upwards. Her bound hands were now level with the bottom of the junction box. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She could see the thick, rubber-coated cable entering the box. It was her only target. With her body screaming in protest, she began to swing her legs, creating a pendulum motion. Higher. A little higher. Her foot slammed into the wall, the impact jarring her teeth. She swung again, this time connecting with the conduit. A dull clang echoed in the silence. Outside, across the street, Finn had the spotting scope trained on the warehouse. He was tasked with one job: watch for any deviation, any change in the routine. He saw the perimeter guards walking their predictable paths. He saw the flicker of a television in a second-story window, likely a break room. Everything was normal. Then he saw it. A flicker, so fast he almost missed it. The floodlights on the west side of the building dimmed for a split second, then returned to full power. It could have been anything: a power fluctuation, a faulty bulb. But his gut, honed by years of surviving on the streets, by noticing things others missed, told him it was more. "Ryker," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "The lights. On the west wall. They just flickered." Ryker, who was about to give the go-ahead to Grizz and Twitch, paused. "You sure?" "I'm sure," Finn insisted. It wasn't a blink. It was like a sag. A power dip. In the basement, Isla hung limply from the pipe, her energy spent. Her foot had struck the conduit hard enough to jostle the ancient wiring inside. She didn't know if it had done anything, if anyone could possibly have seen it. It was a single, desperate flare sent up into an empty night. But for the men watching from the shadows, it was everything. It was confirmation. It was a sign of life. It was a defiant roar from the heart of the fortress. Ryker keyed his radio, his voice a low, cold command. "Grizz, Twitch, you saw that. She's in there, and she's fighting. Signal is green. Execute Phase 1. Now." The two shadows detached from the building and melted into the darkness toward the back fence. The storm was about to break. The night swallowed Grizz and Twitch whole. They moved with a predatory grace that belied their size, especially Grizz's. Dressed in black from head to toe, they were specters against the grimy brickwork of the neighboring buildings. They reached the rear of the Hyperion compound, a section plunged in deep shadow, far from the reach of the streetlights. The chain-link fence loomed over them, its razor-wire crown glinting with malicious promise. Twitch, wiry and agile as his namesake, produced a pair of compact grappling hooks attached to thin, high-tensile rope. With a silent, fluid motion, he tossed one, then the other. They sailed over the fence, catching securely on the building's roof edge, well above the razor wire. Grizz gave a curt nod. Twitch went first, scaling the rope with the practiced ease of a rock climber, his movements economical and silent. He crested the top and dropped lightly onto the gravel-strewn roof on the other side. He unclipped a pair of wire cutters from his belt and went to work on the cables leading from the two rear-facing cameras, snipping them with a quiet thwack. He gave a low whistle, the signal for all clear. Grizz followed, his ascent slower but just as silent, his immense strength pulling his bulk upwards without a single grunt of effort. Once inside, they dropped to a low crouch, their suppressed pistols drawn, their senses on high alert. They were in a narrow access alley between the fence and the warehouse's back wall. According to Finn's intelligence, two guards would be rounding the far corner any minute. They pressed themselves into a recessed doorway, becoming part of the architecture. The crunch of boots on gravel grew louder. Two men, dressed in tactical gear, rounded the corner, their conversation a low murmur. They were relaxed, confident in their sterile, predictable patrol. It was the last mistake they would ever make. As they passed the doorway, Grizz and Twitch exploded from the shadows. It was over in less than 2 seconds. A blur of motion, the soft pip of the suppressed pistols, and two bodies slumped to the ground without a sound. Grizz quickly dragged one into the doorway, while Twitch secured the other, ensuring they were out of sight. Twitch keyed his radio, his voice a calm whisper. "Rear perimeter is sterile. Cameras are dark. Gate is ours across the street." Ryker heard the words, and his blood sang. "Copy that," he replied, his voice tight. All teams moved to breach position. The main force of the Iron Serpents flowed from their observation post like a river of dark leather. They crossed the street in a low crouch, a dozen hardened men moving as one. They reached the back gate, a heavy rolling gate secured by a thick, case-hardened chain and a formidable-looking padlock. Deacon produced a massive pair of 42-inch bolt cutters, the jaws of which looked capable of shearing through steel rebar. He positioned them on the chain. Ryker stood beside him, pistol drawn, watching the building. The air was electric with anticipation. "On my mark," Ryker whispered. He took a deep breath, picturing Isla's face. This was for her. "Mark," Deacon threw his entire weight into the handles. The metal groaned in protest, a high-pitched shriek that sounded like a gunshot in the silence. For a heart-stopping second, it held. Then, with a loud crack, the chain link snapped, and the gate was free. The sound was louder than they'd wanted. From inside the warehouse, a dog started barking, a frantic, aggressive sound. "So much for quiet," Deacon grunted, dropping the cutters. Go, Ryker commanded. Alpha team with me. Bravo, you know what to do. They slid the heavy gate open just enough to slip through. Alpha team, Ryker and 5 of his most trusted men, made a beeline for a side entrance that led, according to the blueprints, directly to the basement stairwell. Bravo team, led by Deacon, fanned out, their weapons raised, preparing to storm the main loading bay doors to create the primary diversion and engage any security on the main floor. Ryker's team reached the side door. It was locked. Without hesitation, one of his men, a lanky ex-sapper named Jinx, slammed a specialized battering ram into it. The wood around the lock splintered. A second hit, and the door flew open, crashing against the interior wall. They poured inside, into a dark, narrow corridor. The sound of shouting erupted from the main part of the warehouse as Deacon's team made their entrance. The diversion had begun. Ryker led the way down the corridor, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. At the end of the hall was a heavy steel door-marked basement access. This was it. The air coming from beneath the door was cold and stale, carrying the faint, metallic scent he'd come to associate with his darkest fears. He kicked the door. It didn't budge. Steel reinforced. Jinx, talk to me, Ryker growled. Jinx examined the lock. Magnetic. High voltage. Can't ram it. From the main floor, the unmistakable sound of a firefight erupted. Shouts, the crack of pistols, the heavier boom of a shotgun. Deacon's team had found the rest of the guards. They were running out of time. Ryker didn't hesitate. Forget the lock, he yelled over the din, breaching charge. Now, the first phase was over. Stealth was a memory. Now, there was only the storm. Jinx pulled a small, compact block of C4 from his satchel and expertly molded it around the magnetic lock mechanism of the basement door. He inserted a detonator with practiced calm, his hands steady despite the symphony of violence echoing from the main floor. Fire in the hole, he yelled, and Alpha Team flattened themselves against the corridor walls. The explosion was a deafening, contained crump, shaking the concrete beneath their feet and filling the narrow hall with smoke and the acrid smell of burnt plastic and ozone. The steel door, ripped from its frame, flew down the first few steps of the stairwell with a thunderous clang. Go! 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 Ryker roared, charging through the smoke-filled doorway before the dust had even begun to settle. He led the charge down the concrete steps, taking them 2 at a time, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. The basement was a maze of concrete pillars and stacked crates. The single bulb Isla had seen was still swinging, casting wild, erratic shadows. And there, at the far end of the room, he saw her. She was slumped against the pipe, her head bowed, her form small and frail in the dim light. The sight of her, bound and broken, sent a wave of pure, murderous fury through him that eclipsed everything else. Isla bellowed. Her head snapped up, her eyes, wide with a mixture of terror and disbelief, locked onto his. Ryker, the word was a fragile, broken whisper. At that moment, Silas Croft stepped out from behind a stack of crates, a sleek, silver pistol in his hand. He was no longer the calm, collected businessman. His hair was disheveled, his face contorted in a mask of rage. 2 of his heavily armed guards flanked him. Predictable, Silas spat, leveling his pistol not at Ryker, but at Isla's head. I told you he would come, my dear. All fury, no finesse, Ryker and his men froze, their own weapons trained on Croft. It was a standoff. Let her go, Croft. Ryker's voice was dangerously low, a predator's growl. This is between you and me. It was always about her. Croft screamed, his composure finally shattering. You and your filth took my legacy. I was going to own this city's future. Now I'll just own your end. Upstairs, the firefight raged. Deacon's team was locked in a brutal, close-quarters battle. The ex-military security contractors were well-trained and heavily armed, using the maze of machinery and storage racks as cover. It was a chaotic dance of muzzle flashes and shouted commands. Deacon took a piece of shrapnel to the arm from a ricocheting bullet, but barely registered the pain, returning fire with a savage roar. He knew his job was to keep these men pinned, to buy Ryker the time he needed. Downstairs, the tension was a physical thing. "There's no way out for you, Croft," Ryker said, taking a slow, deliberate step forward. His men mirrored him, fanning out slightly, changing the angles. "My men own this building. It's over. It's over when I say it's over." Croft shrieked, pressing the muzzle of the gun harder against Islah's temple. Islah, who had been watching, her mind cleared by the sudden rush of adrenaline, saw her chance. Croft was monologuing, consumed by his own drama. His focus was entirely on Ryker. With a surge of desperate strength, she did the one thing he didn't expect. She threw her entire body weight sideways, away from him. It wasn't much, but it was enough. The sudden movement pulled Croft off balance. His pistol, aimed at her head, was now pointing at the concrete wall behind her. It was the opening Ryker needed. The world exploded into motion. Ryker fired, not at Croft, but at the guard to his left. Simultaneously, two of his men fired on the guard to the right. Both men dropped without a sound. In that same split second, Ryker lunged forward, covering the distance to Croft in 3 powerful strides. He didn't use his gun. This was personal. He slammed into Croft like a freight train, his shoulder connecting with the smaller man's chest. The silver pistol flew from Croft's hand, skittering across the concrete floor. Ryker grabbed the front of Croft's expensive suit, lifting him off his feet and slamming him against a concrete pillar. The impact was sickening, a wet crunch that echoed in the suddenly quiet room. "You touched my wife," Ryker snarled, each word a hammer blow as he slammed Croft against the pillar again and again. Croft's legs went limp, his body a dead weight in Ryker's grip. Ryker threw him to the floor in a heap and turned, his fury instantly vanishing, replaced by a desperate tenderness as he rushed to Islah's side. He pulled his K-bar knife and sliced through the zip ties on her wrists with one clean cut. "I got you," he whispered, his voice choked with emotion as he pulled her into his arms. "I got you, baby." "It's over." Islah buried her face in his chest, her body racked with sobs of relief, the familiar scent of his leather jacket and the solid feel of his arms around her the only reality in a world that had been a nightmare. The storm had passed, leaving behind a wreckage of violence and a quiet, profound reunion. Ryker held Islah, gently stroking her hair, whispering reassurances as her trembling slowly subsided. His men formed a protective circle around them, their weapons still at the ready, their faces a mixture of grim satisfaction and fierce loyalty. The sounds of the firefight upstairs had died down, replaced by the sound of Deacon's voice barking orders. Jinx knelt beside the groaning, broken form of Silas Croft, efficiently securing his hands with a set of heavy-duty zip ties. "He's not going anywhere," Jinx reported, his voice flat. Ryker looked down at the pathetic figure of the man who had caused so much pain. All the power, the influence, the wealth, it was all gone, reduced to a bleeding mess on a dirty floor. There was no triumph in it, only a hollow sense of waste. "Get him on his feet," Ryker commanded. 2 of the bikers hauled Croft up, his arms twisted painfully behind him. Ryker stepped in front of him, his face an unreadable mask. "My wife's face is the last thing you're going to see for a very, very long time," he said, his voice cold as the grave. "When you're rotting in a cell, that's the face I want you to remember. The woman whose strength you underestimated." He turned his back on Croft, his focus entirely on Islah. He carefully scooped her into his arms, her body feeling impossibly light. "Let's go home," he said softly. They ascended the stairs into the main warehouse. Deacon met them at the top, his left arm wrapped in a makeshift bandage, his face smudged with gunpowder, but grinning. "All clear, Prez," he said. 4 tangos down, 2 surrendered. The cops are about 10 minutes out. Anonymous tip about a hostage situation and gang violence. The plan had always included a call to the authorities. The Iron Serpents weren't murderers. They were deliverers of justice. They had dismantled Croft's operation, saved Islah, and would now leave the official cleanup to the system, however flawed it might be. They would hand over Croft and his surviving men, along with a mountain of evidence detailing the kidnapping. The club's lawyers would handle the rest. They moved quickly to the extraction point. A black van, driven by a club prospect, was waiting with its engine running. Ryker gently placed Isla in the back, climbing in beside her and wrapping her in a thick wool blanket. Deacon and Grizz jumped in the front. "Where's Finn?" Ryker asked, his voice sharp. "Right here," Deacon said, pointing. The boy was huddled in the passenger seat, his eyes wide. He'd been brought to the secondary location as soon as the raid began. "You did it," Finn whispered, looking back at Ryker and Isla. "You got her back." Isla, her voice still weak, reached out a hand. "Thank you," she said, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "You saved me." Finn just ducked his head, overwhelmed. As the van peeled away from the curb, a deafening roar filled the night. The rest of the Iron Serpents, their part in the immediate rescue complete, fired up their Harleys. They scattered in every direction, a thunderous, chaotic wave of noise and chrome designed to draw the attention of the responding police cars, leading them on a wild goose chase across the city while the van, carrying Isla, slipped away unnoticed into the night. It was a perfectly executed maneuver, a final, defiant act of brotherhood. Back at the Serpent's Nest, the atmosphere was subdued. The club's private doctor, a grizzled old man who had stitched up more bikers than he could count, tended to Isla's injuries. He cleaned her wrists, bandaging them carefully, and checked her for any other harm, his touch gentle and respectful. The men gave them space, speaking in low tones, the adrenaline of the fight giving way to a bone-deep weariness and a profound sense of relief. Ryker never left her side, holding her hand, his presence a solid, comforting anchor. The immediate aftermath was over. The physical wounds would heal. But the deeper recovery, for Isla, for Ryker, and for the club itself, was just beginning. The days that followed were a quiet testament to the club's true nature. The Serpent's Nest, usually a hub of loud music and boisterous laughter, became a sanctuary of healing. The bikers moved with a new kind of reverence, their usual gruffness softened by a shared sense of purpose. They took turns standing watch outside, not as guards, but as guardians, ensuring no unwanted attention came near. Isla spent most of her time in the private apartment she shared with Ryker above the clubhouse. The physical wounds began to fade, the angry red on her wrists slowly softening to pale scars. The emotional wounds, however, ran deeper. Nightmares plagued her sleep, and sudden noises would make her flinch. The club, in its own way, became her therapy. They didn't coddle her or treat her like a victim. Instead, they included her. Grizz would bring her a cup of tea, then sit in silence, just being a comforting, mountain-like presence. Twitch would show her how he was meticulously repairing the engine of an old panhead, his quiet focus a calming influence. They gave her space when she needed it and company when she sought it, allowing her to heal at her own pace. Ryker arranged for a professional therapist, a woman who specialized in trauma, to meet with Isla privately. He knew that their love and the club's protection could only go so far. Isla needed the tools to rebuild the sense of safety that Silas Croft had stolen from her. It was a long, arduous process, but with every session, with every small victory over her fear, she grew stronger. She started sketching again, her charcoal drawings at first dark and chaotic, then gradually shifting, incorporating the images of chrome, leather, and the fierce, protective faces of the men who had saved her. Meanwhile, the wheels of justice, greased by the Iron Serpents' high-priced legal team, began to turn. Silas Croft, denied bail, sat in a maximum security facility. The evidence against him was overwhelming. The testimony of his captured men, the security footage from the warehouse that Jinx had thoughtfully downloaded before they left, and, most powerfully, Isla's own statement. Croft's empire crumbled. His business partners deserted him, his assets were frozen, and his name became synonymous with disgrace. The media portrayed it as a stunning downfall, never knowing the full story of the leather-clad Avengers who had engineered it. The Serpents wanted no credit. They only wanted justice. The most significant transformation, however, was happening to Finn. The day after the rescue, Ryker sat him down at the big oak table in the clubhouse. "You're not going back to the alleys, kid," Ryker had said, his voice leaving no room for argument. "You're one of us now. You have a home here." It wasn't an easy transition. Finn was used to being invisible, to trusting no one. But the serpents were patient. They gave him a room of his own, clean clothes, and more food than he'd ever seen. Deacon, who had a surprising soft spot, took the boy under his wing. He started teaching him mechanics in the club's garage. Finn was a natural, his hands quick and his mind sharp. He started with cleaning tools, then moved on to oil changes, and soon he was helping Deacon rebuild a carburetor, a genuine smile finally reaching his eyes. He was no longer a ghost. He was a prospect, not for the MC, but for a new life. He was family. 6 months after the kidnapping, a small ceremony was held at the clubhouse. Isla stood beside Ryker, her hand in his, her eyes clear and strong. Her latest art piece, a large, powerful painting of a serpent coiled protectively around a single blue feather, hung on the main wall. Ryker called Finn to the center of the room. The boy, now taller and with a healthy weight on his frame, looked nervous. Ryker handed him a set of keys. "They're for the apartment above the garage," Ryker said. "It's yours. We've also set up a trust for you. For school, for whatever you want to do. You gave us back our family, Finn. It's the least we can do." Tears welled in Finn's eyes. But this time, they weren't from fear or loneliness. They were from gratitude. He was home. That evening, as the club celebrated with a barbecue, Ryker and Isla stood on the balcony overlooking the yard. The sound of laughter and the smell of grilling meat filled the air. Ryker wrapped his arms around her from behind, resting his chin on her shoulder. The ghost of his sister, Sarah, no longer felt like a failure. It felt like a promise he had finally kept. He had saved the family he had, and in doing so, had created a new one. "You know," Isla said, leaning back against his chest, "I think I finally understand your club's motto, 'Loyalty is our law,'" he asked. "No," she said, turning her head to kiss him. "The other one. The one you don't say as often." Her eyes met his, full of love and a strength that had been forged in fire. "We protect our own," Ryker smiled, a true, deep smile that reached his eyes. "Always," he whispered, holding her tighter as the roar of a Harley engine echoed in the distance, a sound that was no longer a war cry, but a lullaby of homecoming. The Iron Serpents had faced down the darkness and emerged into the light, not just as a club, but as a bastion of hope, their brotherhood, the ultimate triumph over tyranny. What does it truly mean to be a hero? Is it a badge, a title, or is it the willingness to ride into hell for someone you love? Let us know in the comments what you think of the Iron Serpent's Code of Justice. Share this story if you believe in the power of brotherhood to protect the innocent and support organizations that help survivors of abuse find their own strength to heal.